So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about a more in-depth dive of what my colleague Ray did in the other room, which can be a lot of information. I'm going to try and dwindle it down for the General Data Protection Regulation, and we're also going to talk about some of the comparisons between the GDPR and finance, U.S. finance laws, and of course, HIPAA. So just to get started, you know, the General Data Protection Regulation, most of you know either from this morning or have an inkling, which is why you signed up, that this law, which came into effect in May 2018, had a huge impact on the way that we do business and the way that we manage people's personal information. We have spent a great many years, both in the EU and in the US, in certain specific regulated industries, discussing the importance of data privacy, discussing what the value is that is associated with people's personal identifying information. And by that, you can mean a variety of things. It's your name, social security, physical address, email address, or any combination thereof. And depending on what regulation you fall under, or whether you fall under multiple regulations, it can mean various other things as well. As we'll talk about, the GDPR, I think its strength and its weakness is that it's purposely vague, right? The U.S. has basically taken an approach which is, you know, capitalistic in nature. It looks at you, the business, and says, hey, I want you to take these steps in your business to protect this information. I want you to take these steps to ensure compliance, to avoid data breaches, to avoid this unauthorized access or use. What the GDPR has done is it's focused on the individual right. It's focused on privacy as a commodity, privacy as value, recognizing, you know, the rise of Google's, Amazon's, Apple, Facebook on, you know, basically piggybacking economic gain on our personal information, our interactions on the web, and said, you know what, we're going to take that back. We're going to give it back to the individual. We're going to give them certain rights to those information, and we're going to impose, as a result, as an upshot of that, some obligations on you as a company. One of the things that I think is important and sets the GDPR apart is that it has a very broad and expansive view of what personal information is. It takes into consideration randomized, pseudonymized information that can be pulled together by a hacker worth their salt. And what I mean by that is, say that you manage a website for a hotel. You manage a website for a retail restaurant, and you are on your website tracking the click-through progression of somebody who's looking at your services. And you're doing that for a legitimate business reason, right? Marketing, what's working, what are they interested in, what do I need to give them more of, right? If you do that while tracking an IP address and while tracking a later form submission with, say, their first, last name, and email address, even if you anonymize that information, if that information is stored within your system and somebody hacks the system and they can connect those dots, well, then you may have violated the GDPR. And so what I want to talk about today are some real examples on how this actually impacts the day-to-day of your business. Because the main vein for the GDPR is privacy by design. And it sounds wonderful, and people like Ray understand that better than I do. But privacy by design means that it's no longer sufficient to go to a privacy policy. This is what we're doing. It's all out in the open. Here's your notice. Please click and accept. You actually have to look at the way that your website works. You have to look at the way that your intake forms are being managed. You have to look at your vendor agreements, make an inventory of your vendor agreements, and identify your weakest links, which we'll talk about. So just to get us started, I want you to be thinking in those terms because the GDPR really, its breadth and the potential economic consequences that it brings for U.S. companies as well as companies around the world cannot be understated. It really is a game changer. So this is just a slide that gives you the regurgitation of Article 5 of GDPR, and essentially it tells you that you have an obligation to process information fairly and lawfully, and most importantly, in a transparent manner. And we're going to talk about what that means. And part of that is that when you collect this information, you have to advise them not only that you're collecting it, but why you are collecting it. And the reason why you are collecting it has to fall within specific enumerated categories that are respected as legally enforceable under the GDPR. And you also have to take the time to keep it accurate and up to date, to keep it in a form where you can locate the data for a specific individual in the event that you later receive a request for that information, but at the same time is randomized, pseudonymized, anonymized, so that others who gain access to it cannot. And so it's a very difficult line to walk, and it's something that in practical terms can be daunting when you first approach it. Now, Ray mentioned a lot of the different laws that we are facing, particularly for regulated industries with finance and healthcare. But what GDPR has done and what the California law will do, and eventually, hopefully, the federal law will do, is make it so that when you are in compliance with the overarching GDPR principled law, that you are also in compliance with these more industry-specific guidelines and regulations. And I have a few slides that we'll get into to talk about the comparisons right now of where we are, because there are some lacunas, there are some differences between them that you need to be aware of. But in general, these are your accounting principles. And the most important part to me of Article 5 is Section 2, which says that the comptroller shall be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with these principles. Well, if that's not vague, I don't know what is. And there's a reason for that. We have been looking at the last 10 months of enforcement and very curiously wondering what the GDPR was going to mean, particularly for U.S. companies without a physical presence in the EU. We've gotten those responses, the latest with Google in 2019, which we'll touch upon, but what you can gather generally from all of the enforcement actions and the investigations to date is that the GDPR data protection authorities have decidedly sought the low-hanging fruit. They have decidedly sought to enforce from the top bottom and from the bottom to the top. So it really is going to affect everyday businesses. Anyone who has a business online. Who here has an email address? Come on. Who here has a website? Who here has cookie notices on that website? It's a significantly less portion of hands. And I'm not trying to shame anybody. You are not alone. The vast majority of U.S. companies polled before the enactment of the GDPR said, and we're talking 60 to 70% said, this is going to impact my business. I know that I need to make changes. But before the enactment, or right after the enactment of GDPR, only 21% were in compliance. And of course, it's the daunting nature, right? Where do you start? How do you do it? How much money is it going to cost me? How many people are involved? And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The critical compliance considerations of the GDPR, the main one for me is extraterritoriality, right? Because I have a lot of clients that when I talk to them about the GDPR, they say, well, I don't live in the EU. I don't do business in the EU. I may have a couple of EU people who've contacted me, but you know, it's very small, few, and in between. I'm not going to spend all of this money to be in compliance just to deal with a request by them to be forgotten. Or I don't need to spend that because I can deal with the handful of people that I have who want to be forgotten. Famous last words, right? The low-hanging fruit for the DPA authorities has been looking at people who have changed their privacy policies only, and as Ray said, and I'll add to this, there's nothing worse than grabbing someone else's privacy policy, except if whatever policy you enact, you don't follow. And so a lot of times, particularly when you're grabbing someone else's privacy policy, you're not going to follow it because it's not tailored to your business. And if it's not tailored to your business, then you're doing yourself a disservice, because it's just one more ding that you'll get when they look at where you're coming from, what the violation was, how did you handle it, and how egregious it was. Broad definitions of processing of personal data. The U.S. has a much narrower definition. The personal data definition under the GDPR includes any information directly or indirectly identified or identifiable as a natural person, including their name, identification number, location data, online identifier, IP address, or otherwise. One or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of the natural person. So if you're taking a landing page on your website and you want to understand the demographics of who is interacting with you, whether they be Hispanic, whether they be white, what is their education level, what is their geographic position, all of those things, if combined, can lead to the identification of a person. Well, you're dealing with personal information that is going to be subject to the GDPR and requires a heightened approach to security. The fact that you have one or two Europeans that may deal with you, or the fact that you in 2020, after 2020, may have a couple of Californians who deal with you, is sufficient, I think, to justify the cost. And the reason for that are all of the reasons that Ray mentioned. We're moving in this direction. The people who are in the finance industries, the people who are in the health industries already know this. It's just a factor of the way that we are developing an online world and transferring all of this information into easily accessible on your mobile, on your email, on your PDF, e-signing documents. You just think of the breadth of information out there. And it makes sense that this is the approach that we're taking. Unfamiliar terminology, data controllers and data processors. Essentially, the data controller is the organization that arguably has control over the information. It receives it and determines how and when and why to process it, right? Data processors are your vendors, your third-party people, your computer IT system, your CRM, client relationship management tools. How many people here use client relationship management tools? Good. That's a good thing. How many people have reviewed your vendor agreements to make sure that they're GDPR compliant? That's a scary thing. Although I'm glad to see Ray raise his hand. That's good. Your information is safe with us. So you're always going to look at the weakest link, right? And your weakest link in the past has been employees, for example, with master password access, insufficient passwords, two-factor authentication. And we've really, between all of the U.S. laws, we've and the breach notification laws and the obligations that have been coming to pass, we've really done a good job, I think, that most people, whether they actually implement it or not, they recognize the importance of it and why we need to do that, why it's crucial. What we haven't done is realize that the wealth of information that is out there is much broader than what you and I would expect. Your click-through process in a website has value. That has value to advertisers, it has values to the bottom line for your company, and it's something that generally is tracked. If you are connecting in social media and you have, you're using Google Analytics, you're using Facebook Analytics, what are they doing with that data to give you the information that you're getting in return? You are still the data controller, even though they are processing it. And so under the GDPR, one of the things that I found to be most impactful is that both the processor and the controller, they have an obligation and they are liable. So it's an expanded pocket, right? And it's not something that, as we in the United States are used to contractually, we can contractually allocate this risk and be done with it and be certain. The fact that both parties have this obligation and could have this potential liability has serious implications, not just for the bottom line, but for your insurance coverage, right? When you're looking at insurance coverage, when you're looking at cyber coverage, there are very big differences in first-party coverage, third-party coverage. First-party coverage is very expensive, and what do I mean by that? I mean data notification costs. I mean data response costs. I mean the forensic analysis to stop the breach. I mean public relations for reputational harm, business loss, business income interruption. The list goes on and on. So if you're looking at your insurance policies, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that with our experts in the back of the room, but if you're looking at insurance policies and you're looking at endorsing cyber coverage to your package commercial general liability policy, sure, you may save on premium, but you'll pay for it in the back end because that's only going to cover third-party liability. And as we've talked about, the third-party liability part of cyber is really being explored, right? Whether or not there's a private cause of action, whether or not they have a cause of action for mental anguish, for emotional distress. I say some would probably rightfully argue that they do, depending on the impact. But courts have been reluctant, at least thus far, to recognize it, although there is one that should be on everybody's radar. And we'll talk about that. So other unfamiliar terminology, the supervisory authorities or the data protection authorities, which I've been mentioning and been remiss to define, I apologize. These are simply, the power to enforce and regulate the GDPR rests with the courts of justice, but the general enforcement, the day-to-day investigation, the recommendations for fines and penalties comes at a member state level. There have been member states that have been very active: the Irish authority, the French authority, the German authorities, and recently the Austrian authority in the context of small businesses, which I really want to talk about because I think that's fascinating. For people who are, the non-Googles of the world. So the mechanics of compliance: follow the data. I stole that. GDPR means more than updating your privacy, and we talked a little bit about that. You have to map your personal data processes. You have to accommodate the rights of EU subjects, and that includes the right to be forgotten, the right to request a copy of the data that you have on file, the right to understand and have a list of parties with whom that data has been shared, the purposes for what it has been used, to have accountability, to mitigate in your risk supply chain. So this bleeds into the fact that they are keeping both data processors and data controllers liable. They don't want this shell game of liability where you can just say, oh, I relied on this person, they told me X, Y, Z. If you were given the information, you have a continuing obligation, which requires, of course, going down the chain, making an inventory of your vendors, making an inventory of the provisions that they and the steps that they take to mitigate risks, the insurance coverages that they have, the whether or not they are transferring data off-site geographically, which is something that a lot of U.S. companies, how many people have you contact in India? That is an issue. That is an issue. And it's something that we need to be aware of in order to comply with these obligations and with the obligations that are coming down the pipe, either federally or at the state level. The big one, of course, that frightens people is the nature of the violation, and the fines under GDPR can be, 4% of your global turnover, 2% of your global turnover, depending on the nature of the violation. I take great solace in the fact that the first tech giant, Google, to get fined, got a big, hefty $56 million fine, almost 57, but that's nowhere near 4% of their global turnover, at least I don't think so. So what the first rulings have really come out to show is that, yes, we're going to fine you, but we're going to be proportionate to the harm, right? So that's an encouraging sign. It's an encouraging sign for small businesses. So that, and it's also encouraging that in the fines that we'll talk about, the mitigating factors of how you respond in the event of a loss, of the steps that you took to avoid the loss, of the nature of the loss, whether it's a 0 day or otherwise, those things are all going to come into account, and they really have taken them into account. So a lot of the fright that came with the implementation in May has not died down, but it's been attenuated by the very reasonable approach that most of these authorities have taken. So GDPR versus Privacy Shield, Ray really talked about this. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. I think the important thing to note is that just because you are Privacy Shield compliant or self-certified, or now self-certified with confirmation by the appropriate authority, it does not mean that you are GDPR certified. I get this question a lot from my clients. There are additional steps that you must take to document compliance. GDPR is heavily document compliant driven. You want to take, which is something that lawyers, we get a little nervous about, right? Because if you find something bad, you don't want to have a whole bunch of documentation about it before it becomes discoverable. But at the same time, when you want to show compliance, it's a necessary step. So I cannot say this enough. When you undertake your analysis of whether or not you are in compliance, when you undertake your inventory of your vendor agreements, of where your data is, who you're sharing it with, where they're taking it, whether it's being shared in another way, it's really hugely important to keep a document, and in essence, a universal document that indexes where those items are, who in the organization is responsible for those items, what provisions of particular contracts are of consequence, what provisions can be negotiated, what can't, and that you keep that inventory up to date as much as possible, because in the event of a fine, be it domestic or foreign, that's going to have a huge impact as a mitigating factor, as will your ability to have put in place a response plan and to execute it the way that you envisioned it. Any questions about that? Let me ask you guys, how many people have checked into a hotel, signed their documents, get your keys, and then 15 minutes later you get this very nice text that says, "Hey, welcome to Harrah's. If you need anything, please call or text this number." Raise the hands. Lots of people. Okay, good. That's working for them. It's very nice convenience, but do you remember telling them they could do that? I don't, right? And so when you look at the GDPR and you compare GDPR to the U.S. laws, remember, U.S. laws go with, the CAM-SPAM Act, GLB, they all look at it from an opt-out perspective, right? We got to change the way we think about things. GDPR looks at it as consent, and not just consent. It is informed consent, right? So this is the one time that your lawyer is going to say, put it all out there, right? When you write your privacy policy, if you're running Google Analytics, if you're running Facebook Analytics, if you're using a CRM software, I encourage people to list that and to list a link to their terms and services, because it has been found in recent GDPR investigations that can be a mitigating factor. The fact that you are truly trying to provide them with informed consent. And of course, the only way that you can do that is to go through that retrospective evaluation internally, identifying the right departments that need to be involved. You're going to want legal, you're going to want the executive team, you're going to want HR, you're going to want marketing, and anybody that you farm those aspects of your practice out, because all of those people are touching this information. You also want to limit the amount of people who have access to that, or limit what their credentials to access information can access. Why? Who are your weakest links, right? I mean, I can think of several in our organization who shall remain nameless, who have passwords, right? And may use those passwords to access something on a mobile device, and may be hacked, or maybe using, God forbid, the same password that they use at work on a mobile device, which is unrelated to work. But, any hacker worth their salt knows where you work, right? And they can hack into the personal device because it doesn't have all the bangs, whistles that the work one does. And guess what? All of a sudden, boom, they're in. So limiting credentials to what they really need to see, changing passwords, multi-factor authentication, constant training. It is not enough to have a training session once a year or once every 3 years. This is an area that is constantly changing. The reason we speak in terms of 0 day is because even the best and brightest minds in the room, there's always something new. Just last night, is Antonio here? No. All right, he's on my blacklist. He didn't come see me talk. Antonio with J.P. Morgan, he shared a story with me last night, which I thought was interesting, so I'll share with you guys. Some of these high net worth individuals, people who are retired, they're no longer working with an IT group through their company. They've got all of their money, hopefully in, of course, J.P. Morgan Chase. So they're relying on basically the banking system to assist them. Well, they're also buying sometimes properties that are in inflated value, and they're getting their emails spoofed, right? Once they hack into your personal email, they know who you're dealing with, they know when you're going to buy it, they know how much you're going to pay, they know how many installments. And so what they do, all they have to do is to create a convincing email typical to the closing attorney that you've been dealing with, send you that wire information, you forward it to the bank does what they're supposed to. They pick up the phone, they call you, and they say, hey, do you want me to wire your life savings to this account? And you say, why am I having to deal with this? I just sent it to you. Yes, wire it. Well, guess what? Is the bank on the hook for that? Or is that you? And these are people, it's a generation with the most wealth, the baby boomers who are now exiting the workforce, who do not necessarily want to adopt and change with, and I mean no disrespect by that, it's just a fact. It's like millennials can use the clicker when I couldn't. You got to understand who your targets are and where your weaknesses are. Who's vulnerable within the organization? The lower employees, the employees with access to sensitive information. Who's vulnerable from an industry standpoint? Well, finance, HIPAA, schools. I'm not going to know if my daughter's information has been hacked until she tries to get her first credit card, which, God help me, better be when she's 30, right? But she could already have that information hacked. She is already on the internet. She already has an internet presence. And as a mother, I have an obligation to protect that digital presence. So it's a change in mindset. And these regulations, what I find so fascinating about the GDPR is that it really has made people think that way simply under the threat of economic sanctions, right? So whether or not they impose them and how much they impose them is, I think, less important to the mindset that it has changed. And I'm very pleased to see that California and other states are now following in that direction, because quite frankly, a patchwork in the United States is much more difficult to deal with than a single regulation. So hopefully we'll get Congress to do something. Okay, so GDPR-specific requirements and obligations, we've talked about this. It's transparent consent, right? And so in the CAM-SPAM Act, we had opt-out, the unsubscribe button, which is buried at the end of the email, requires you to uncheck things sometimes, and quite difficult to use, right? So I just keep getting JCPenney's deals every day. But in the GDPR, not only is that insufficient, you have to take affirmative steps and change the way that your website, your newsletters, your emails work to have a pop-up page that is explicit in what you're going to be using, whether you're using cookies, what you're using them for, whether you're sharing information with others, whether they're sharing information with others, all of the various factors as transparent as humanly possible, and have a legitimate reason for it, right? And they have to be able to, and then you have to follow it. So I come down, I was told I can't come down from the stage, so they know me. I come to you, Catherine, and I am a website, and I say, hi, here's my cookies notice. I'm going to use your information to make my website a better website and, perhaps market some things to you that may be of interest to you. Do you accept? Hi, I'm a Tahitian beauty. Would you like to come to the Caribbean Sea with me? Well, you didn't expect that, did you? That is not something that you had consented to. But yet we still have websites that have piggybacks onto that website that are using those cookies and sharing those cookies for information. And I know some of you've seen my presentation before, so I apologize for the repetition, but it bears repeating, right? Because we have to ask those questions of ourselves if we don't have an IT department, and of our IT department if we do. Because a lot of times, they're not asking those questions. This is new to everyone. And while they may be perfectly capable of creating the fix, you cannot fix a problem that you don't ask the question, right? Okay. Privacy by design. It's not just about your terms of service, your privacy policy. It's how you capture leads. It's your consents and re-permissions. This was a big deal. How many people here got a barrage of privacy notices in May of 2018? I mean, it was embarrassing, right? How many of you read them? Exactly. Well, yes, I know you did. That's not fair. That was all driven by the GDPR. But what people don't notice is, so they went with the low-hanging fruit. This is what I was talking about earlier, right? We're going to go ahead and change our privacy policy because that's easy to do. We're going to go ahead and add a cookies consent or a cookies notice policy because that's relatively easy to do. But that's not enough, right? You then have to go internally and say, what do I do with that information? When I get a form submission, or when I get a client who's purchasing something from me in an electronic software, where is that information going? Where is it being stored? Who are the vendors that touch that information, and where are they storing it, right? It's so much more intricate. And it's so much more than just the website. You have to look beyond the ports of entry for your information to the end user and everything in between. And so privacy policies are a great place to start. Cookies and notices and re-permissions, whenever you change your privacy policy, it's important to not just change it, but to actually prompt prior registered IPs to actually accept the new privacy policy. And I think, the days of where you put at the beginning of your privacy policy, well, this is subject to amendment from time to time, I think those days are over. And it's an easy fix, it's a quick fix, but a lot of people don't think about it. So granularity is what we're trying to get to, right? Granularity. All the things that make an insurance lawyer happy. And nobody else, thank you. Okay, so factors considered, and you need to do regular impact assessments. I think everybody should do that no matter what. We have a room full of very capable sponsors and speakers here that can talk in a great more detail than I can about what would go into an appropriate data impact assessment from a technological standpoint. I highly recommend that you do that in conjunction with the 5 main or 4 main or 10 main departments that you work within, and the heads of those departments that will be in charge of describing the information processes that you use, what information you use, where you intake it, where it goes, how long it's stored, whether it's used for any other purposes, and then doing a deep dive with an audit to see if you're correct, right? Because a lot of times we'll go in there and we'll look at what the paperwork says, what the lawyers did, and it does not speak the same language as the IT, right? They're smarter. It's okay. We need to make sure that the right hand and the left hand are speaking to each other continuously, and that when updates happen, updates to your programs happen, and that is a group effort. And so I highly suggest that you speak with some of the people that we have here today. We've got some great minds in the room. And of course, I'm happy to help in any way I can as well. Automatic decisions leading to legal consequences, determinations of credit, for example, various processes, seeking data for incapacitated persons or young individuals, minors. Those are all heightened senses of security that you need to be aware of and you need to take account of. Records of data processing, we've talked about this. The bottom line with the GDPR, and I think with most of your compliance with data protection, online privacy regulations, is to keep a record of what you do and to follow the processes that you implement. You have to make sure those processes are tailored, but you also have to make sure that you are following them, updating them, and documenting them. Because it's not a matter of if you're going to get a breach, you will. So you're going to want to have this information to protect you. You're going to want to have this information to show your insurers that you were following, whatever programs and processes you put on your underwriting application, which we'll talk a little bit more about in risk management perspectives. EU-based representative, depending on the size of the U.S. company, they may need to appoint someone to represent them in the EU. I'm hesitant to say this is a shall. I think it is more of a may, but you certainly have to have someone appointed within your organization as the data privacy, the data protection contact, both to enforce these obligations, update your privacy policies, manage that internal evaluation, and to make sure that they can respond to subject requests for access. Record of dating, we talked about that. GDPR specifics, and you guys are all going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, by the way, because I'm not sure that we'll make it through everything. But these are some of the things that you need to ask yourselves about whether or not you're ready and whether or not you're compliant in a way that you can address subject access requests. You can recognize them, you understand when the right applies, you have a policy to receive and process these requests in a timely manner. There are very short turnarounds under the GDPR. You understand whether or not you have a requirement to provide supplementary information. You understand when you can reject them and when they're inappropriate. These are questions that you need to be asking when you're going through this GDPR compliance audit and this introspective process. U.S. domestic enforcement, well, we have not yet had one, but there is certainly case law out there that would suggest, even in Louisiana, although we have not enacted the Uniform Country Money Judgment Recognitions Act, that penalties from the EU under the GDPR could and would be enforceable in Louisiana. There are a series of factors of legalese that I will skip, but it's there for those of you who have a penchant for either not being able to sleep or just masochistic. It is a possibility. It is a very real possibility. And it's one that I think we'll see with, Google and the Canadian companies, Facebook, that are all currently under investigation. Better late than never. This is what I mentioned earlier. 60% of businesses were aware that this would change. 71% acknowledged that it would potentially hinder global business, but nobody was ready for it. So if you're not ready for it or you haven't done it, you're not alone, right? It's never too late. We're still not at the year anniversary. I quite frankly thought that we would have had a lot bigger, some bigger hits with Amazon, Apple, and Facebook, but the sheer fact that they've taken this long to investigate suggests to me that the drum roll is going to be, a crescendo at some point. Key takeaways. I'm gonna, we've really gone through these, so I'm gonna skip this. Follow your data, privacy by design. Review, revise your data retention practices, consent practices, and really your weakest links, your internal employees, your passwords, your two-factor authentication, mobile and portable devices, and all of which are very important from an insurance coverage standpoint, and we will talk about that when we do the risk management's perspective panel. Hot topics have been politics, financials, health insurance, and social media. Surprise, surprise. The one that I really wanted to talk about is the Google fine. Lack of transparency, inadequate information, and lack of valid consent regarding ads personalization. And so this really sets up that war of, well, I provide this service as Google, which everybody uses. I need to be able to make money off of it somehow, so I've done that with ads. If I give you all of this information that I'm, about how I'm targeting you, am I giving away a trade secret? Am I giving away something of value to me? And so who really owns that value is a question that we're going to be seeing answered by what I think will, be the next round of decisions. U.S. financial regulations, we talked about this. The GDPR places a great responsibility on data controllers, data processors, and gives great rights to the data subjects, whereas finance laws, HIPAA laws, they look more to the company, the regulated entity. What I've done here is I've included some comparison slides, which you will get, and I'm not going to go through those. Essentially looking at the Fair Credit Reporting Act and GDPR, the similarities and the dissimilarities between the two, and the same with GLBA. The main one being, of course, that GDPR is more granular. It gives you specific lists of information that you need to require, whereas I think the American way is to give you a broad spectrum and have you work within that spectrum. To give you the option to opt out as opposed to required consent. So those are the main issues I think that people need to focus on from that standpoint. For those of you in the healthcare industry, there are 3 slides with a comprehensive comparison. I highly recommend that you take a look at them, and I'm happy to sit down and chat with you with any specific questions that you have on that, simply because I'm running out of time. Crystal ball predictions, and this is a fun one for me because, the United States, we get hit we're so litigious, particularly Louisiana. I think we ranked, 500 out of 50 states for litigation climate. I have a feeling that under the GDPR that will change because it has created individual rights of action with mental distress and material damages that can be sought. The DPAs have taken their rules and their regulations and their oversight authority very, very, very seriously, and so have the citizens of the EU, in particular in trying to put U.S. companies through the paces. I've had several clients that have received these types of requests in a barrage of requests once the law went in. They are of the nature of people who like to challenge and make sure that their rights are recognized and enforced. We too were that way, and what happened was litigation. And so I think you'll see a rise of litigation, private litigation in the GDPR. I think you'll also find an even greater imbalance in the negotiation of vendor agreements. When you're playing with the big boys, they're going to want to make sure that the risk is allocated to you. They're going to have certain boilerplate language that they can use to make sure that they're in compliance, and so it's going to be an exercise in balance and negotiation and what you can do to make sure that you too remain compliant and that their processes in line with your processes. So it's something to even pay more attention to. I think there's going to be more of a global push of privacy as a human right, or we're finally going to say there is no privacy. And so what happens with that, I think, the impact of and the advent of artificial intelligence and biometrics is going to have a huge impact on that. And then similarly, the GDPR will and has, with the United States, already pushed other countries to pursue their own privacy and electronic information and data breach protection acts, not the least of which are China, Japan, Costa Rica, my home country of Panama, so I'm very proud of that, and yes, even Russia. So it's something that if you do business internationally, it's something that if your vendors do business internationally, not only does it make you a target because you are in potentially a hot zone, or you're in an industry that is a target, say national security, infrastructure, oil and gas, utilities, but you're going to have more than just the 50 frameworks of the United States and the GDPR, and it's something that you really need to consult with your counsel, with your in-house, with your IT group, to make sure that you're dotting all your lines and crossing all your T's. And so I have completely run out of time. I apologize. Are there any questions before I get down? None? All right. Well, thank you guys for listening.
That was great, Jackie. Thank you. I just have a housekeeping announcement. If you were late getting to the conference and just walked into the opening session and may not have registered, would you please register at the counter? It's sort of important.